Yeah, welcome back, everybody. And we are now featuring our second presentation that will be given by Nils Liersch. Nils Liersch is a doctoral student at the University of Marburg and also research associate in the already mentioned project which is directed by Yoga and Ayurveda and Jim Melanson on a critical edition of the Hatha Pradipika. Welcome, Niels. We are very happy that you are able to join us here virtually and introduce us to the work that you are currently doing with your presentation entitled The Tattvayogabindu of Rāmacandra and its 15 medieval yogas. So the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, Philip. I'm super happy, honored, grateful to be among this a great lineup of speakers at this conference. And I also feel a rush of excitement arising in my body. Must be this vital energy Jim was referring to. Let me start sharing my screen. I hope this works. Can you see my presentation? So, as Philip already mentioned, I'm working together with James Melanson, Jürgen Haneda, Jason Birch, and Mitsu Emoto in the Hatha Pradipika project. And embedded within the framework of this project, I'm also working on my dissertation. So in this talk, I will summarize some interesting, but I have to say preliminary results of my ongoing dissertation project, which is the constitution of a critical edition and annotated translation of the Tattvayogabindu. The Tattvayogabindu is among a larger group of medieval yoga texts that have been printed once based on an arbitrary and now unknown manuscript. This first and only printed edition of the year 1905 is accompanied by a Hindi translation, but presented in the titles as Bindu Yoga as part of Raja Yoga. No information on the sources is given, and there are important discrepancies to the manuscripts that have already been checked. There's a little problem with the title. You will read here in the title of my presentation, Tattvayogabindu. As I already just mentioned, in the printed edition, the text is simply called Bindu Yoga. But looking at the manuscripts that have already been checked, we find this three-membered compound consisting of Tattva, Yoga, and Bindu, and all sorts of combinations. So here, I preliminary go with the title that the oldest and most frequently is given in the manuscript colophons. So there are also other possibilities that I take into consideration, like simply switching yoga and tattva. So we had the Yoga Tattva Bindu, there are other works, for example, the Siddhanta Tattva Bindu, which would be along those lines of understanding the title. So, but for now, we simply call the text here Tattva Yoga Bindu, which could translate as a drop into the yoga that creates that basically creates tattva, which would be here referred as a Raja Yoga text to samadhi. Tattva could be also translated as suchness, which in those Raja Yoga texts very often, as you will see, translates or means samadhi. So the text is composed according to the colophons by one Rāmacandra or Paramahansa Rāmacandra, probably in the 17th century. And the text deserves attention mainly. It provides a highly differentiated taxonomy of types of yoga. It names and describes 15 types of yoga, which are presented as subtypes of Raja Yoga. The text belongs to a larger group of yoga compendiums written between the 16th and 19th century. Jason Birch, who has done an incredible preliminary work for my work and his research on Raja Yoga, has briefly described the text in the context of the 15 medieval yogas in his 2014 article, Raja Yoga, the Reincarnations of the King of All Yogas, which is a shared list by Narayana Tirtha's Yoga Siddhanta Chandrika, where these yogas are, however, subjected to Patanjala yoga. There are further connections to other descriptions of types of yoga, as for instance, Sundardas Savanga Yoga Pradipika, a Brajbhasha text from the 17th century, and the Tattvayogabindu is intimately connected to the Yoga Svarodaya, which is, however, known only through quotations in the Pranatoshini, and as I discovered just recently, the Yoga Karnika. Thus, the Tattvayogabindu seems to be an important independent source for the 15 medieval yogas, and thus a representative of a pre-modern conceptualization of yoga just before its colonial reconfiguration. So in the course of this presentation, we will take a close look at the list of 15 types of yoga and discuss its function in the work, its relation to other codifications of yogas during that time period, and possible origins of this list. Whilst looking at that, we will also explore some of the text's most interesting, curious, and sometimes odd contents. So this is a manuscript from Pune, a black and white scan. I highlighted the list of 15 yogas with Raja Yoga on top at the 15th place. So far, I have collected 9 manuscripts and the printed edition. Several more manuscripts are deposited in libraries across India and have not been collected yet due to COVID. The text is written in a simple, almost textbook-style Sanskrit and was more likely nearer to the milieu of lesser educated practitioners than to Pandit theoreticians of yoga. It provides materials and attests to an awareness in yoga circles of specific health effects of certain types of yogas, a topic that is greatly expanded in modern yoga. A certain yoga is said to cure incurable diseases, and in another practice, one has to imagine oneself from head to toe in a bright light of different colors, which removes all diseases. Another interesting feature of the text is a lengthy passage on the importance of guru worship, which is an important feature even into modern yogic groups today, but not sufficiently documented in the more well-known highbrow yoga texts. The whole text can be seen as a yogic compendium, written mostly, verses are not indicated in the printed version, in prose, where different topics are introduced in sections, introduced by recognizable phrases. So a topic is usually introduced with idanim, now, and then the content follows, katyate is taught. So we will see that just in a couple of minutes. So sections often deal with subtypes of yoga and their effects, but also cover topics like yogic physiology in much detail. The text is quite difficult to edit, since very often I encounter heavy grammatical issues. Manuscripts have an astonishing deviation of punctuation, which complicates the matter even more, and the structure of sentences varies greatly among the witnesses. The manuscripts that are still in India and that have been collected already are scattered over all corners of the Indian subcontinent, which speaks for its popularity at some point. So let's have a look at this, at the introduction of the Yoga Tattvayogabindu. So the text begins with, I simply read the translation to save time. I don't want to come into position that Jim was previously. Homage to Sri Ganesha. Now the methods of Raja Yoga are laid down. This is the result of Raja Yoga. Raja Yoga is that by which long-term durability of the body arises, even amongst manifold royal pleasures, even amongst the manifold royal entertainments and spectacle. This truly is Raja Yoga. of this Raja Yoga, these are the varieties. And then the text gives the following list. First yoga that is mentioned is Kriya Yoga, the yoga of, I translated it here, as you will see in a couple of minutes, yoga of mental action, Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge, Charya Yoga, the yoga of wandering, Hatha Yoga, the yoga of force, Karma Yoga, the yoga of deeds, Laya Yoga, the yoga of absorption, Dhyana Yoga, the yoga of meditation, Mantra Yoga, the yoga of mantras, Lakshya Yoga, the yoga of fixation objects, Vasana Yoga, the yoga of mental residues, Shiva Yoga, the yoga of Shiva, Brahma Yoga, the yoga of Brahman, Advaita Yoga, the yoga of non-duality, Siddha Yoga, the yoga of completions or the yoga of the siddhas, and Raja Yoga, which of course can be translated in various ways, but I found it for this presentation maybe most suitable to translate it as the superior yoga or the yoga that is king, or could be also translated as a royal yoga or something along those lines. All those yogas that are presented here in this list are presented as varieties of Raja Yoga and means to Raja Yoga. And yeah, let's look again at this interesting definition it gives for Raja Yoga. So Raja Yoga is that by which long-term durability of the body arises even amongst manifold royal pleasures, even amongst the manifold royal entertainments and spectacle. So for me, this emphasizes somehow the health benefits which are mentioned throughout the text on the physical body, even if the practices are not physical, and highlights that the results even appear without abstinence from worldly pleasures. That suggests to me, in a certain way, that this text might have not been written for an ascetic audience, but that this definition and this text was aiming at a more worldly, profane audience. In the subtext of this definition, there's even also an allusion to Raja Yoga in the sense of yoga appropriate for kings. And in fact, there are just a very few works in the 18th century containing the gloss of Raja Yoga as the yoga fit for kings, which is the Raja Yoga Bhashya and Divakara's commentary to the Bodhasara. But before we dive deeper into the curiosities of the text, I will quickly, for the sake of providing all listeners an adequate background, recapitulate the state of research regarding the history of Raja Yoga. So this, what I'm going to present you in the next 2 slides, is primarily based on a research paper provided by Dr. Jason Birch. I already mentioned it in the introduction, Raja Yoga Reincarnations of the King of All Yogas, and a presentation Jason Birch was giving in the year of 2019, the Tantric Shaiva Origins of Raja Yoga. So all credits should definitely go to Jason and his incredible work that he's been doing on Raja Yoga. So let's look at the state of research. So the earliest evidence we have of the term Raja Yoga appears in an 11th century Shaiva work called the Amanaska. There it says Rajatvat Zava Yoganang Raja Yoga iti smritaha. Because it is the king of all yogas, it is known as Raja Yoga. And then in the period between the 11th and 15th century, the term Raja Yoga appears also in 5 other yoga texts next to the Amanaska, which is what Jim already mentioned, Amarauga. Then another text that Jim has not mentioned, the Yoga Vidya, the Tattvayogabindu Yoga Shastra, the Yoga Taravali, and the Shiva Sanghita. So 4 of those texts are Shaiva, except the Tattvayogabindu Yoga Shastra, which is a Vaishnava work most likely. So we see that in the early history, Raja Yoga was strongly associated with Shaivism. And much of the terminology and soteriological ideas defining it can be traced to Tantric Shaivism, particularly the Kaula traditions. And most of these texts, as most of you should know, they usually teach a 4-fold taxonomy consisting of mantra yoga, laya yoga, hatha yoga, and raja yoga. However, unlike the Amanaska, they promote the first three yogas as acceptable methods for attaining Raja Yoga. The Amanaska dismisses the other yogas. In all texts, Raja Yoga is the goal of the other yogas, as we also see here in the Tattvayogabindu. And in all cases, Raja Yoga is the only one of these yogas that bestows liberation. Yeah, Raja Yoga in this early period means always the attainment of a profound state of meditative absorption, more generally called samadhi. And the terminology that describes it is the same as in the Tantras to convey the aspectless state of Shiva and void-like meditation. So those Raja Yoga texts rely on terminology like Nishkala, undivided, Manonmani, transcending the mind, Anmani, beyond the mind, Niralamba, independent, Niranjana, immacule, and Tattva, suchness, to describe Samadhi. So Jason Birch draws the conclusion and proposed that the term was coined probably in the 11th century as a part of an attempt to integrate yogas from different traditions into a hierarchical scheme in which a Shaiva interpretation of Samadhi and liberation in life, Jivan Mukti, was preeminent. Therefore, it seems probable that the compound Raja Yoga was a label for a Shaiva interpretation of Samadhi, which Shaivas obviously believed was the best yoga. And the Shaiva status of this fourfold yoga was bolstered by the inclusion of visualization practices on Shiva in both mantra and laya yoga, and the claim that hatha yoga could raise Kundalini. There's a funny story with Kundalini going on in the Yoga Tattvayogabindu. You will see that in just a few slides. So even though, and that is, we should maybe highlight here, even though religious leaders in the 19th to 20th century, like Swami Vivekananda, Swami Shivananda, developed yoga systems based on Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga, called it Raja Yoga, and promoted the Yoga Sutra or the Patanjala Yoga Shastra as the most authoritative source on Raja Yoga, the history of the term Raja Yoga reveals that it did not derive from Patanjala Yoga. Indeed, it was not until the 16th century that this term was used in a commentary on the Yoga Sutra. The earliest definition of Raja Yoga is found in the 12th century Shaiva Yoga text, as already mentioned, called the Amanaska. From the 12th to 15th centuries, Raja Yoga was mainly used as a synonym for Samadhi, yet after the 16th century, the textual evidence reveals many attempts to reinterpret the name and connect it with different systems of yoga. So now let's deep dive into the Yoga Tattvayogabindu, and I found it quite interesting to compare the list of the 15 yogas given in the beginning with the actual structure of the text, since it reveals several curious, interesting features of the Tattvayogabindu as such. So here you see that I hope you can see it in this Zoom setup really well. It needed to cover a lot of space. So on the left, you see the topics introduced. On the top left, you see the topics introduced in the Tattvayogabindu with the respective phrases introducing a new topic like Atta or Idanim. On the top right, you see the list of the 15 yogas. And those ones we've already covered in the course of the text. I highlighted always the yoga that I'm currently talking about, and I enrich it with an interesting quote regarding this certain type of yoga and how it's conceptualized and characterized in the course of the text. So here we have the introduction of Kriya Yoga. So Idanim Kriya Yogasya Lakshanam Katyate. Now the characteristics of Kriya Yoga are taught. And so the text starts, obviously, with the first yoga given in the list. And the section that follows, or parts of it, I have here extracted and want to read to you. So this yoga is liberation through mental action. It bestows success sitting in one's own body. Each wave the mind creates at the beginning of an action, of all those one shall withdraw oneself. Then Kriya Yoga arises. Patience, discrimination, equanimity, peace, contentment, etc. are generated in his mind. He alone is called the yogi of many actions, a Bahu Kriya yogi. Fraud, illusion, property, violence, craving, envy, ego, anger, anxiety, shame, greed, error, impurity, attachment, aversion, illness, heterodoxy, false view, affection of the senses, sexual desire. He who diminishes these from day to day in his mind, he alone is called a yogi of many actions. So, I mean, there are various systems of Kriya Yogi. Most of the people would immediately probably think of the second chapter of the Patanjala Yoga Shastra, where Kriya Yoga is described as I think it's what is it? Definitely in a different way, and that is also very important for when we later will compare this list of the 15 yogas to the Yoga Siddhanta Chandrika of Narayana Tirtha, who also gives a quite similar list of 15 yogas. However, there he, of course, sticks to the Patanjalian definition of Kriya Yoga. So looking at the next topic introduced in the Tattvayogabindu, things start to get a little bit more interesting. Then it says here, Idanim ya Raja Yogas ya Veda Katyante. Now the divisions of Raja Yoga are taught, which are these Teke, Eka, Siddha Kundalini Yoga, Mantra Yoga. So this is quite interesting, since we started with the first item in the list, and suddenly in the course of the text now we are jumping to the 8th place, the Yoga of Mantras, Mantra Yoga, and to the 14th place in the list, the Siddha Yoga, Yoga of Completion. And the other curious thing is that the term used here in this introduction of the topic is not Siddha Yoga as one would have expected, but Siddha Kundalini Yoga. And then the other yoga is directly attached afterwards, which seems rather odd to me. And I always thought in the beginning, when I was reading the first manuscripts and the printed edition, that this must be a scribal error. But in fact, all witnesses I've collected so far, even the oldest ones among them, they transmit this formulation. And the next odd thing about this section of the text is that the word Kundalini is somehow miraculously inserted into this compound Siddha Yoga, but it will not be mentioned in the text anymore at all, and play no role whatsoever. And what follows here then is first the description of the 3 main channels, so a little bit of teaching regarding the yogic physiology, and then a very detailed account of a 9-fold chakra system. And it's explained in very great detail. All imaginable associations with chakras are listed: gods, goddesses, certain powers, certain colors, lotus leaves, and what they mean. And then for each chakra, usually it is said that if you perform dhyana yoga onto that chakra, so you have to meditate, focus your mind on that chakra for a prolonged period of time, and then this and this and that result will manifest for you. And there is no mention at all of mantra yoga, except maybe that certain yogas are associated with certain seed syllables, like the small syllables, but there are no instructions or explanations what to do with those syllables. So it's quite odd that this formulation appears at all. So let's have a quick look how this is described. So what are these yogas? So it says Eka, Siddha Kundalini Yoga, Mantra Yoga. I translated this as one is Siddha Kundalini Yoga and one is Mantra Yoga. These two Raja Yogas are described in the following. At the location of the root bulb exists one major vessel in the form of energy. This single vessel splits up into these openings, which are Ida, Pingala, and Sushumna. On the left side is the Ida channel, being a resemblance of the moon. On the right side exists the Pingala channel, being a resemblance of the sun. Within the middle part is a lotus pond, being very subtle. It is made from a web of light, and it shines like 1,000 lightnings. She emerges as the central channel and is the bestower of enjoyment and liberation. While abiding in her, knowledge arises to the point of which the person becomes all-knowing. The means for the genesis of knowledge in the central channel will now be described. And then follows this rather detailed explanation of a ninefold chakra system, as I mentioned before. Let's have a look at the next item on the list. It is introduced as Idanim Sukhasadyo Lakshya Yoga Katyate. So now the simple practice Lakshya Yoga is introduced. And then there are 5 subdivisions of this Lakshya Yoga practice given. Let me read the translation of my working edition. Now the yoga of fixation, which is easily accomplished, is explained. Of this yoga of fixation, there are 5 subdivisions. Urdhva Lakshya, the upward directed fixation. Adho Lakshya, the downward directed fixation. Bahya Lakshya, the outer fixation. Madhya Lakshya, the central fixation. And Antara Lakshya, the inner fixation. And what again is quite unexplainable to me yet, is that first the text gives an explanation of those 3 first Lakshya practices. Then 3 other types of yogas from the list are introduced, and then suddenly the 2 remaining ones are explained and introduced as separate topics, as you will see. But before that, let's look how one of those Lakshya practices is defined, or what is done there. So the text says, at first, the upward directed fixation, Urdhva Lakshya, is explained. The gaze, the drishti, should be in the middle of the sky. And then, having caused the mind to be directed upwards, it is caused to be fixed there. Due to the exercise of stabilizing of this fixation, Lakshya, arises unity of the gazing point, drishti, with the light of the highest Lord, Parameshvara. And then an indefinable, invisible object arises in the middle of the sky. It arises in the range of sight of the practitioner. This is truly the upward directed fixation. So, what is very interesting about this practice, it is covered in such a lengthy way in comparison to other yogas that are explained in the course of the text, that it might be the main and most important practice for the author and the tradition he was belonging to. But this is just speculative at that point of my research. Next, another yoga is introduced, which is Chaya Yoga. So we jump to the 3rd place of the list. And it says, Idanim Chaya Yoga Katyate. Now Chaya Yoga is taught. And I think I translated this for now as the yoga of wandering or striving, something like that. So now Charya Yoga is explained. There's a typo. The self is as such, shapeless, unchangeable, permanent, and unsplittable. Unmovable, it is situated in such a person. His self is not touched by sin and merit. Just as the heap of lotus leaves situated in the middle of the water doesn't touch the water, in the same way the self is not touched by sin and merit. Just as the wind wanders according to its own will in space, likewise the mind of whom is absorbed into objectlessness wanders according to its own will in space. This is Chaya Yoga. And that's it. So basically, that is the whole topic of Chaya Yoga covered in the Tattvayogabindu. So it's rather short in comparison to, for example, Lakshya Yoga. Then Hatha Yoga is introduced. So the yoga of force or something along those lines. And the practice shall be done according to the mode of breath, exhalation, inhalation, and retention, etc. The purification of the body arises due to the 6 practices. When the breath fully abides in the middle of the sun channel, Surya Nadi Madhye, then the mind is unmovable. The form of bliss immediately shines through the motionless mind. Due to the execution of Hatha Yoga, the mind becomes absorbed into emptiness. The time of death does not approach. And that's it already for the first type of Hatha Yoga. So I would have expected a longer explanation, but what is quite interesting, a second type of Hatha Yoga is explained and introduced. Idanim Hatha Yogasya Dvitiya Beda Katyate. So now the second division of Hatha Yoga is explained. The shine of 10 million suns in one's own body, beginning from the feet to the top of the head, is contemplated in any color equal to white, yellow, or red. Due to the execution of meditation on that, all types of diseases won't arise. Vitality increases. I'm not sure if this has any direct forerunners. Maybe Jim can tell us a little bit more about that. But I had immediately to think of the practice that, for example, is combined with the Amrita Siddhi's teaching in the Goraksha Yoga Shastra, the text I critically edited for my master thesis, where the bindu, the breath, and the mind has to be united with 3 lights along the central channel in the navel, the heart, and the head. But this was just one association that comes along with it. But we have to observe here that those explanations on Hatha Yoga are extremely short for my taste and for being a rather long compendium. This is pretty, just pretty short. Then the next topic is Jnana Yoga. So now the characteristics of Jnana Yoga. In brackets would be better is explained because actually there's no Katyate this time. And Jnana Yoga is explained, as you see here in the quote, he shall see the world truly as being one, shining in all selves. By applying indistinctness, he shall accomplish Jnana Yoga. He always attains the Shambhavi state, the innate highest goal, just as the seed of the Nyagroda tree scattered onto the soil always becomes a tree. Only one thing is, and not something else. Whoever knows that is a knower of reality. And also this explanation of Jnana Yoga is rather short. And then something miraculous happens. A yoga appears that is not in the list of 15 yogas. Idanim Ashtanga Yogasya Vichara Katyate. So that was quite striking to me that because I was expecting, even though he was not following the order of the list, that there shouldn't be another yoga introduced here to this system. And there are several interesting things going on within this rendering of Ashtanga Yoga in the Yoga Tattvayogabindu, which I now will present you. So now the procedure of the Eightfold Yoga is explained. Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, Pratyahara, Dhyana, Dharana, and Samadhi. So whoever knows the Yoga Sutta, you will immediately recognize that Dharana and Dhyana are switched in this system. So the oldest manuscripts and most of the manuscripts share this list of the Angas. There's just one very late manuscript that gets the list right. So I for the moment, I kept it like that. So their characteristics will be explained. These are the yamas: peace, conquer of the senses; little food, conquer of sleep; conquer of cold and heat. The niyamas truly are keeping the mind from the unsteady state and grounded in calmness, retreating to a lonely place, refraining from contact to living beings, unchanging intellect, buddhi, keeping equanimous, one shall not crave for things, as well as being content with what is given. Never forgetting the name of the highest Lord, one shall not cause the mind to enter into depression. So if you would compare this list to the yamas and niyamas popularized by the Patanjala Yoga Shastras, Ashtanga Yoga system, one would immediately recognize that this is a completely different list. So we can easily conclude that the author Rāmacandra was definitely not referring here to the Ashtanga Yoga system as taught by Patanjali, but speaking about a yoga system here, an Ashtanga yoga system that was rendered maybe through some Shaivite traditions that I've not yet identified. And then it continues with more interesting material. It says that the characteristic of asana has been discussed in many works and will not be discussed here. So he chooses a very simple path to cover that subject. And then it says, and that I find very interesting, pranayama can't be practiced by young persons. That's why it is just mentioned by name. And I was thinking about that quite a lot. That about this reason that pranayama can't be practiced by young person, and that's why it's not just it is just mentioned by name here. And in fact, this text is always rather descriptive instead of prescriptive, and it usually doesn't explain any kind of extreme yogic practices, rather the soft ones in comparison. And I was thinking that maybe this is a hint this is just a speculation, a hypothesis, that maybe the audience were young persons. Maybe even when we recapitulate the definition from the beginning, where it says that where the physical aspect of the practice of Raja Yoga is emphasized, that it brings usually a stable body, good health, and so on, but also that it works even among royal entertainments and spectacle and so on and so forth. So maybe this text was, I don't know it yet, taught at some kind of royal court for young people in the course of their education. But this is just an idea. Pratyahara is when the mind is directed onto escaping from samsara and caused to remain in the self. Changes within the mind arise, but they are supposed to be kept off. Not just one miracle arises in the Buddhi due to that, they are secret. Dhyana has been taught many times. Because of that, it is not discussed here. And in fact, scattered all over the various topics given in the text, the term dhyana yoga occurs frequently. However, it is not introduced as a separate topic in the course of the text. And now one would expect next one of those yogas, Karma Yoga, Laya Yoga, Dhyana Yoga, Vasana Yoga, Shiva Yoga, Brahma Yoga, or Advaita Yoga. But in fact, that's it. So only 8 of 15 yogas are properly introduced in the text. What follows is usually a very detailed descriptions of yogic physiology and partially also yoga metaphysics. And terms like karma, laya, vasana, Shiva, Brahma, and Advaita, they appear, but the terms karma yoga, laya yoga, Shiva yoga, Brahma yoga, and Advaita yoga are completely absent from the text and not treated as separate yogas. For example, the term Shiva only occurs once in the whole text. Also, vasana occurs once throughout the text. Laya and karma, similarly, the term Brahma appears a lot of times, and Advaita also appears just once. So I concluded, so first I was thinking that maybe the whole list was a later edition by a scribe at some point of history where this list was quite popular in India. But as we will see in the following, the text is basically a re-rendering of another text, a prosaization of a lyrical text called the Yoga Svarodaya, as I mentioned in the introduction, only known by quotations from the Prana Toshini and the very recent yoga compendium, more practically oriented, the Yoga Karnika. All right, so quite interesting. And we look now at the Yoga Svarodaya. Here, the introduction goes a little bit different, but it teaches a very similar list. And you will see in the next slide that the Yoga Svarodaya and the Yoga Tattvayogabindu are very, very closely related. And basically that the Tattvayogabindu exactly follows the structure topic-wise as presented also in the Yoga Svarodaya. And back in 2014, when Dr. Jason Birch in his articles wrote a little bit about the relation of those two texts, he already suggested that one of them has to be based on the other. But now I could clearly identify several direct quotations of the Yoga Svarodaya within the framework of the Tattvayogabindu, so that it is quite clearly pointing for one direction, so that the Tattvayogabindu derived primarily from the Yoga Svarodaya. So here begins with now Raja Yoga as described in the Yoga, now Raja Yoga as described in the Yoga Svarodaya. God said, I will teach Raja Yoga. Listen, in every case, it bestows completion. It is more secret than secret, O goddess. Its nature is manifold and it is higher than the highest. By means of Raja Yoga, O goddess, the person shall be an honorable man like a king. The Raja Yogi may have a long life and he may be equipped with the 8 supernatural powers. This yoga has 15 varieties, but just I think 8 here are presented in this list. What follows: the Kriya Yoga, the Jnana Yoga, Karma Yoga, Hatha Yoga, Dhyana Yoga, Mantra Yoga, and then a term. So this is from the Prana Toshini, and there we indeed find the word Ura Yoga. Whatever that is, must be a scribal error while copying. I'm quite sure there exists no Ura Yoga, or either the word Ura in Sanskrit is not really existing, and Vasana Yoga. And after that, it says, by means of these 15 yogas, this person who is resting in Brahman shines like a king. And look at the next slide. So here I shortened it a little bit. One could extend this this table here greatly, but this is just the structure of the Yoga Svarodaya next to the Tattvayogabindu, and it's just the introduction of the single topics. Actually, if you look at the content, you, like everybody that knows a little bit of Sanskrit, can see that that those texts are very closely related, and I would say 90% the Yoga Tattvayogabindu is directly following the contents of the Yoga Svarodaya as quoted in the Prana Toshini. So first Kriya Yoga is introduced, and then here it's quite interesting, the Siddha Kundalini Yoga. So here's again a typo. This is actually a quote from the printed edition that actually says really Kundalani Yoga. But the Siddha Kundalini Yoga and Mantra Yoga, which was so odd in the course of topics I presented to you, here is Jnana Yoga. And then also, as in the Yoga Tattvayogabindu, the Yoga Svarodaya starts with a list of 9 chakras and what happens if you practice meditation onto the respective chakra, but it's just called Jnana Yoga here. And if you remember, the quote I've been presenting in the context of Siddha Kundalini Yoga, Mantra Yoga, was that it explains how knowledge arises in the central channel. Then also Lakshya Yoga with its 5 varieties is explained also in the same way that first the 3 are explained, then other topics are covered, and then the second 2 practices of Lakshya Yoga are explained. Similarly, Hatha Yoga, then another Jnana Yoga. So Jnana Yoga appears twice in the Yoga Svarodaya. Ashtanga Yoga, and in the final section, the Yoga Mahatmyam, which is the passage that is very detailed presented, where the text goes into the role of guru worship, how to find the proper guru, what are the characteristics of Sadguru, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, it is quite interesting. So, looking at the verse here with the 8 yogas given by the Yoga Svarodaya, one might speculate that in the Prana Toshini there is one more verse missing, which wouldn't be surprising for this text, that a verse got dropped by the author. Or the other way would be that indeed the Yoga Svarodaya originally was as presented here, and in this version was also accessible by Rāmacandra, so that he had to make up the remaining items of the promised 15-fold system here in the Yoga Svarodaya. All right. Now here, this table shows the 4 texts that have been identified sharing similar lists. The first, second column, you see once more the list of the Tattvayogabindu. The second column, the list given by the Yoga Svarodaya. The third column, the list of the Yoga Siddhanta Chandrika. And in the last column, the list of the Savanga Yoga Pradipika. So we already looked in detail of the 2 lists of the Tattvayogabindu and the Yoga Svarodaya. And now looking at the list of the Yoga Siddhanta Chandrika, as I mentioned, it's a text that is a commentary on the Patanjala Yoga Shastra or the Yoga Sutra. And in this commentary, those 15 yogas are introduced. And as you can see here in that list, the order is a completely different order. Instead of Siddha Yoga, we have Siddhi Yoga. And instead of Raja Yoga on top, we have Prema Bhakti Yoga on top of the list. Looking at the contents of the Yoga Siddhanta Chandrika, it becomes very clear that Tattvayogabindu and the Yoga Siddhanta Chandrika content-wise have basically nothing to do with each other except sharing the list. And in the explanation, for example, of Kriya Yoga and Dhyana Yoga and the Siddhi Yoga, where he introduces also siddhis, he always sticks to the Patanjalian interpretation of yoga. So looking now at the last column, the Savanga Yoga Pradipika, we also find striking similarities, but also some differences. Here, for example, we also have an inclusion of Bhakti Yoga, as in the Yoga Siddhanta Chandrika, but also of Ashtanga Yoga, now occurring in the list, which is quite interesting. Sankhya Yoga, and Sankhya Yoga is another novum here in this list in comparison to the others. So all of those lists and all of those texts are approximately written in the 16th or 17th century. And I would say, looking at that this way of listing yogas somehow was fashionable during that time period. But so far, I mean, a little bit more research, I think definitely has to be done. I haven't looked into the Sarvanga Yoga Pradipika, for example, due to my lack of understanding Braj Bhasha in so much detail. But seemingly they don't have so much to do with each other on the first sight. But yeah, we can say that this list was fairly popular in this time period. So I think now I also have to hurry up a little bit. Let's come to my conclusion. So the list of the 15 yogas in the Tattvayogabindu emphasizes the superiority of the main yoga taught in the text, which is obviously Raja Yoga. And looking at comparing the structure of the actual text with the list given in the beginning, it was probably not the intention of the author to fully teach each yoga in the list, but to highlight the preeminence of Raja Yoga. And yeah, the Tattvayogabindu is very much in line with the features of earlier texts of this genre and employs the same strategy, integrating yogas of other traditions into a hierarchical scheme with a Shaiva interpretation of Samadhi. And another observation that I have not mentioned yet, but that I want to mention here, is the text beautifully aligns with the general tendency of a steady increase of asana, mudra, and pranayama techniques, the amount of chakras taught, and along those lines, obviously, in taxonomies listing the various types of yoga that we can detect from earliest texts of Hatha and Raja Yoga from the beginning of the 11th century to the eve of colonialism. So you might have recognized the jump from in the earlier Raja Yoga text. We just have this fourfold scheme of mantra, laya, Hatha, and Raja Yoga, and suddenly we have a system and a codification of 15 yogas altogether. So the Tattvayogabindu seems to be primarily the result of a prosaization of the Yoga Svarodaya with additional quotations from the Siddha Siddhanta Padati, the Amanaska, and a few additions from the author himself, and is clearly deeply rooted in the Raja Yoga traditions of Shaivism. And even though, as we have seen, similar lists appear in the Yoga Siddhanta Chandrika and Sarvanga Yoga Pradipika, those texts are seemingly unrelated content-wise. More research has to be done, of course, it might change. And more research also needs to be done to pinpoint the origin of the list. Yeah, that's it from my side. I also talked a little bit longer than I should. I apologize for that. I hope even that everybody enjoyed this talk, the yoga practitioners, the teachers, and also the academic audience. And yeah, I'm looking forward to hear some questions or comments. Thank you for your attention. And yeah, that's it from my side.
Yes, thank you very much, Nils, for this very clear guidance through the Tattvayogabindu and related texts. We have approximately 6 minutes of time for questions. And I would like to ask the audience to raise their questions, to put up their hands, and maybe we can have some live questions.
Well, we had a few in the chat. Okay. One came from Alexander. Where mantra and laya yoga come from? I'm not sure if these designations were used in the pre-Raja Shaiva yoga texts.
That's a good question. Where do mantra and laya yoga come from? Maybe would be a good question for Jim. I'm not sure. I'm just aware of the mentioning, for example, in the early Hatha Yoga text where those lists appear, but I have not done any further research yet to pinpoint the earliest references to those types of yoga. Does anyone want to comment on that? Maybe Jim, do you know?
Oh, just a second.
Hello, I can unmute. Yeah, thanks, Nils. That was great.
Yeah.
Yeah, just in brief, yeah, the first sort of categorization of 4 yogas as mantra, laya, hatha, and raja is in the Amarauga, which then gets taken up in the Tattvayogabindu Yoga Shastra. But it's not as if the techniques of mantra and laya are new then. They're old techniques that are then just being sort of put into categories. I think we can be confident there.
And do you know of the oldest sources of those techniques?
Well, I mean, mantra yoga, you know, corresponds to things going way back. But normally in the text, it's identified with sort of tantric mantra practice. And laya yoga, well, it's where it's most clearly explained in the Tattvayogabindu Yoga Shastra. It's these various different methods, you know, very simple methods like meditating on your big toe that are quick, relatively easy methods for attaining laya, so absorption. It's just a, you know, and then later on, well, in the Hatha Pradipika, laya is identified as given as another synonym of samadhi, like Raja Yoga, you know, gives a long list of different synonyms of samadhi, and laya is one of them. I can't remember exactly how the Amarauga defines it, but it's pretty complicated. If I remember right, or not that clear, not so easy to understand.
Yeah, thanks for helping me out, Jim.
I wonder, have you worked out a date for this text? Have you worked out a relative chronology, at least, with the other ones?
So the earliest manuscript is written in the end of the 16th century. I think one from Delhi, I think I calculated 1598. So end of the 16th century, beginning of the 17th century can be said. Yeah.
Quite old, but no indication of a geographical location or a specific author.
Not yet. The author is Paramahamsa Rāmacandra Paramahamsa. But so far, I haven't had enough time to dive deeper into that subject. I'm at the moment in the process of editing, and so far I have covered maybe the half of the text with the nine manuscripts.
Okay, and one last question from me: with the Ura yoga. And there's been a few interesting suggestions in the chat, by the way, you should have a look at. But have you, I mean, do all the manuscripts have Ura in this place? Or was that in a different text? And that was in
so this is only the Yoga Svarodaya is only known from the quotations of the Pranatoshini and the Yoga Karnika so far. But there must be manuscripts in India that I will try to get hold of. Then I probably can say more if it's a scribal error, or if it's really in those manuscripts. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So actually we have a live question from Gudrun. Just a second, I open the microphone for you.
Yes, thank you very much. I really enjoyed being introduced to this new text. I wanted to ask you, I mean, the name of the compiler, I wouldn't say author, it looks like a compilation, maybe, from material that was around at that time. And the name is Rāmacandra. So do we have some Vaishnava elements coming out? I mean, there was a Shiva yoga, but there wasn't really a Vishnu-related practice there.
Not that I'm aware of.
It seems very odd that his name is Rāmacandra, and then they put him in the Vaishnava fold. So the other thing that it's appeared to me, I mean, this seems like a compilation of somebody who maybe had heard about some types of yoga but didn't really know enough about it, so he couldn't describe it in detail. Some of the descriptions seem very superficial. I mean, I haven't read the whole thing, so we probably get more substance in some other sections, but it seems some of the things that you presented, he didn't really have a deep knowledge about them.
or they were not so important to him. For example, this Lakshya yoga is covered in great detail. But obviously, you're completely right with this observation. So that might be one interpretation why we find such short accounts of Jnana yoga, Hatha yoga, and so on and so forth. But other topics, something that I have not talked about in the course of my presentation, is the yogic physiology, which is covered in very great detail in comparison to other texts of that genre.
And what is the size of that text approximately in stanzas?
In stanzas, since it's written in prose, I cannot exactly tell you the amount of stanzas, but usually it has. Let me have a quick look. About 40 folios, recto and verso, 9 lines, and maybe in verse it would be maybe 300, 400, probably the length of the Amrita city.
Yeah.
I can imagine.
And compared,
I might be wrong on that.
Yoga Svarodaya, I mean, what is the relationship? Is it a lot shorter than the Yoga Svarodaya?
No, the text is a little bit longer since it's written in prose, so it's not so compact. And he also adds material, as I said, from the Amanaska, this Siddha Siddhanta Padati. And I think this Chaya yoga he introduces, which is not there in the Yoga Svarodaya, but he clearly sticks to the structure and content of the Svarodaya. And this Yoga Svarodaya, since we just know it through these quotations in the Pranatoshini, we cannot really say how the complete work looked like until we have not checked the manuscript. So if anybody in the audience here has manuscripts or holds manuscripts of the Yoga Svarodaya, I would be very happy if you would share it with me, or if you have come across the text. Yeah. Thank you for your questions, Gudrun.
Karen O'Brien just mentioned in the chat that the sequence of dhyana and dharana is sometimes inversed in Anga presentations of yoga. And we also find this in the older manuscripts of the Nyaya Bhashya, where we also have a kind of Yoganga scheme mentioned, but with dharana and dhyana in the inverse sequence. So it's not so unusual that this may appear. So yeah. But yeah, Nils, thank you very much for this fantastic presentation, introducing to us a novel text. We see how much work there is to do, how much textual work there is to do in the subject of yoga. Yes, I thank you very much, and I appreciated your presentation a lot. So we now have a longer break in our program, which gives us all the opportunity to rest a little bit, to eat something. Unfortunately, the joint dinner that we had envisaged has to be skipped. Yeah, there's no point in having this online, so we will have to care for ourselves and reunite at 7:30. From 7:30 to 8 o'clock, we have a half an hour talk on new perspectives on yoga research and practice, where we would like to engage a little bit about the question how research and practice are interrelated, which benefits are there for taking research into consideration, or whether these are two or should remain two separate fields, which we obviously don't believe. So thank you very much, Nils, again, and see you all later.